Hello and welcome to Hacktivity Explained, the series where I pick out some especially cool bugs found by other bug bounty hunters and explain and summarize them for you. Today we have two really cool bugs, one CORS Misconfiguration into a CSRF chain, and that's found on Atlassian Confluence, and then we also have a local file read turned into an SSRF, which was found on Evernote. So we'll start off with Atlassian Confluence. So Confluence is an application used to store and edit documents. It's basically like Google Documents, except it's built by Atlassian. And the main thing about Confluence is that you can run it on your local server. So you can download the Confluence framework onto a server, and then you can host it on a domain, so you can expose it to the internet. And companies do this if they want to run like an enterprise kind of version of it, or they run it on like their own website and they have like a subdomain like Confluence or something, and then they run that internally. So instead of sending off documents to the cloud, they can instead have it running on their own servers, which a lot of companies prefer, especially if they might be dealing with like sensitive data or something. But if the company exposes their Confluence server to the internet, then by default there's a few endpoints which are also exposed. And one of those endpoints is this one, which is the plugin servlet OAuth consumer info endpoint. A bit confusing. But it uses CORS headers to allow other origins to send requests to it, because OAuth generally requires that. So it will set these two headers, which is the access control allow origin header and the access control allow credentials header. That basically allows other origins to make requests to it and also to include the user's cookies, which is also something that's needed for OAuth. Unfortunately, this access control allow origin header doesn't allow more than one origin to make requests to it. Now, if you remember my previous video, developers often have issues with this header because you can't actually add multiple origins to it. And this access control allow credentials header will refuse the wildcard character. So you can't have this header set to this wildcard here and then also have this set to true, because the browser will basically reject that request, right? So what the developers have to do is they have to make the origin dynamic. So they have to set it as the origin request is coming in. And they usually do that by matching it to specific values, and in this case it was matching to this directory, so this one right here. So there's nothing really wrong with that. That was pretty much all secure. The bug bounty hunter didn't find anything wrong there, but there was an issue, right? So by default this endpoint didn't have any user input. You could user data you could steal. You couldn't use their credentials. The developers made sure because you could send the user's credentials and you could do a cross origin, that there was no information stored there that could be used against the user. But what they kind of forgot about was the 404 page. So the 404 page was like a default template that they just used. So if you typed in like an endpoint that didn't exist, in this case this one right here, you could the CORS headers were still appended to him, but because this default template was used, it wasn't like sanitized against user data not being stored in it. So what could be stored in a 404 page? Well, in this case, a very important piece of user data, which ended up being the CSRF token you see here. So basically the attack scenario is the following, right? So if you know what kind of Confluence domain the user is logged into, you could basically redirect them to this endpoint right here. So an endpoint that doesn't exist in the consumer info page, where the Confluence server would return this 404 page, and then you could steal their CSRF token, meaning that once you have their CSRF token, you can perform any actions. So as long as you clicked on an attacker's website and they knew where you were logged into, they could perform any actions on your behalf because they have your CSRF token now. So the impact there is decently high. And it was actually a very simple attack as well. just 2 steps to explain it here, you see, and it was also fixed quite quickly. So the attacker received for this $3,200, which you might be thinking is not actually a lot for an Atlassian program, especially considering the impact here. But I think the reward was reduced here for 2 reasons. One was this behavior that the author mentioned himself, which is the same site cookies. So same site cookies, the same site attribute, was introduced by browsers, and it basically prevents cookies being sent cross origin unless this attribute is changed to same site none. By default, it's same site lax, which I believe means that you can send cookies across subdomains. So in this case, if the victim was using Chrome, this attack wouldn't work because Confluence was using the same site lax cookie, which meant that the user's credentials couldn't be sent with the request. So in this case, it only worked in Firefox. And as well as that, the second reason I think the bounty was reduced was that you had to actually know the domain where the user was logged into, which is a decent which is a significant piece of knowledge you have to know. It's not always easy to know that. So that's why, sorry, it was $3,600. It was rewarded twice for that. Still a very interesting bounty and a very uncommon chain, I would say. I really wished I included this in the video about CORS because this is a very cool vulnerability about CORS. I couldn't actually find much else. Definitely into a CSRF chain is extremely interesting, and something that you definitely wouldn't even think of. The developers probably never paid attention to this 404 page. So try looking for these kind of unexpected attack vectors, especially when you're dealing with CORS attacks. This kind of stuff might occur sometimes. So next we'll move on to Evernote. So Evernote is this note-taking application / productivity tool, and you can access it on Android, iOS, or its web server, which in this case is where the vulnerability resides. And here on the web server, the website used this strange looking request to load static files, so JavaScript and CSS. And if you're very savvy, you might realize that the middle components here are actually they're actually base 64. And after decoding this, the attacker saw that it's actually a file name, and in this case it was a CSS file name. And when he sent the request, well, the file name appeared. And it's also interesting that it's a path parameter, so it's not just a file name, it's actually a path which is base 64 encoded. Now, anything that's processing these paths, and especially in this kind of encoded manner, is gonna potentially be vulnerable. So the attacker thought about using SSRF. And the way he did that is, instead of just supplying this kind of like directory path, he instead submitted an actual URL format. So what he was looking for is to leak the website's backend credentials, so for the servers. And I think in this case the server was running on Google Cloud, so this is the metadata endpoint for that. And if you can leak those credentials, I think that means that you can log on to their servers and basically hijack their entire website. So it's obviously a very critical vulnerability if the attacker managed to do that. So after a few attempts to reach the URL, the attacker wasn't actually successful in doing this. And that's because, if you see here, he was attempting to do this without this .js endpoint. And the website was using a URL validator. So it was checking if the URL ended in a .js or a .css file. And otherwise, it wouldn't actually return it to you. But you can actually use this hashtag delimiter to kind of trick the server into thinking that it is actually a static file. What this hashtag file does is, if the website's using like a parser to read the URL, this hashtag will basically detach everything to the right. So this will just be ignored, and this will just turn into the actual main endpoint that it's connecting to. And in this case, because the validation was a bit weak, it actually succeeded, and this static file was the server was tricked into thinking that this was a static file. And so the attacker was then able to access the backend metadata for the company. And what is also interesting is that you can actually read local files with this as well. So the file protocol also worked here, and you could read like the edc.password file using this. And yeah, the attacker got 5,000. I'm pretty sure this was rated a critical by Evernote. Well, this is definitely an interesting vulnerability because I've personally never seen an implementation like this. And one would ask why the developers even did this. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Or potentially, I think the attacker doesn't, the hunter doesn't explain this here. But I think it might be to load multiple files at the same time. Because if you see, you have like these like base 64 encoded strings here, and they're all in like a directory file. So I kind of have a suspicion that this was used by Evernote to load multiple files at the same time. That's just my theory anyway. But either way, it wasn't a very good implementation. So it is interesting why it was like that. That's just the main HackerOne report. I don't think I left anything out, did I? Yeah, no. So it was rated a critical, and in this case, the bounty was $5,000, which is the maximum for the Evernote program. So in this case, since you could read any file on the server, there was basically no way to lower the severity here. So a very nice vulnerability for the attacker, and quite an unexpected one, with the SSRF being inside the directory file. So it is keeping those in mind and paying attention to those static files sometimes as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video and you've learned a decent bit from these two bug bounty reports that I really enjoyed reading. And if you like this content, then you can watch my previous Hacktivity explained video where I cover 2 account takeovers, one on Uber and one on Zendy. And if you're a bit confused about the CORS headers and that vulnerability, then my previous episode is actually about CORS misconfigurations, and it goes into details about the access control allow origin and the access control allow credentials header. So that would clarify a lot for you. And as always, thanks for watching and happy hunting.